On the 15th of March, 44 years before the Common Era, the most powerful man alive walked into a building and never walked out. Julius Caesar didn't die quietly. He died surrounded by men he trusted, men he'd promoted, men he'd forgiven after a civil war. They drove their blades into him 23 times. Some of them missed and cut each other. When it was over, Caesar lay crumpled at the foot of a stone monument to Pompey, the very general he had once defeated. The killers stood there, breathing hard, their togas soaked red. They raised their daggers in the air and declared Rome free again. But freedom needs an audience that believes in it. And when the assassins stumbled into the streets expecting a celebration, they found something far worse than opposition. They found indifference. The people of Rome stared at them the way you stare at strangers who show up uninvited. These senators talked about tradition, about the sacred balance of power, about protecting the republic from a dictator. But the average Roman didn't care about senatorial tradition. They cared about whether they could eat tomorrow. Caesar had fed them. Caesar had given them land. Caesar had looked at the poor and actually seen them. And now, Caesar was dead on a marble floor. Then came the will. When it was read aloud in public, every Roman citizen discovered that Caesar had left them personal gifts, money from his own fortune, and his private gardens along the Tiber for the people to enjoy forever. The grief that had been simmering exploded. Fury poured through every district of the city. Mobs built a bonfire in the Forum and nearly burned Rome to the ground. The conspirators had miscalculated everything. But their greatest blind spot wasn't the crowd. It was a name buried in that same will. Caesar had formally adopted his grandnephew, a frail, sickly young man, barely 18 years old, Gaius Octavius. A boy so unimpressive that Brutus and Cassius dismissed him the way you'd dismiss a stray dog near a battlefield. They assumed he would fade into irrelevance, maybe beg for scraps of influence from the Senate. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. That pale teenager would spend the next 14 years methodically hunting every single man who had raised a blade against his adopted father. From the hills of Greece to the shores of Egypt, no distance was far enough, no alliance strong enough to protect them. This is not a story about an assassination. This is the story of what came after. A manhunt that crossed continents, shattered armies, and ended the very republic those killers swore they were saving, replacing it with an empire that would worship Caesar as a god for centuries. Before we get into it, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the moment. You're here with Ancestral, the best dark history channel on the planet. Caesar's blood was still pooling on the marble when the first crack appeared in the conspiracy. The floor beneath him was slick and dark. His toga, the garment of Rome's supreme authority, hung in ribbons, soaked through. The men standing over him gripped their weapons like they were afraid to let go. Some of their hands trembled. A few of them had never taken a life before that morning, and now they had driven iron into a man who had poured wine for them, who had pardoned them after a war, who had called some of them brothers. They had stabbed him in the chest, in the spine, in the face, over and over, until he stopped fighting and simply fell. For a handful of seconds, nobody moved. Then the panic hit. Senators who had nothing to do with the plot scrambled out of their seats like animals fleeing a fire. Some tripped over stone benches. Some crawled on their hands and knees toward the exits. A few sat frozen, unable to look away from the circle of killers standing over the crumpled body. The assassins shouted at them to stay calm. They held up their hands, still wet and red, and swore this was not a crime. This was salvation. Marcus Brutus, the man history would turn into a symbol of the ultimate betrayal, tried to seize the moment. He had hesitated during the attack. His blade had found Caesar late, but now his voice was the loudest. He declared that Rome had been unchained, that the nightmare was over. Beside him, Cassius, the cold strategist who had stitched the entire plot together, urged the others to stand straight, to show their faces, to walk like men who had just performed a duty, not committed a murder. They had planned the killing with obsessive precision. Who would grab Caesar's robe to hold him still? Who would deliver the opening strike, where each conspirator would position himself so the blows came from every direction at once? They had chosen Pompey's theater deliberately, placing the act beneath the statue of the man Caesar had defeated, as if the ghost of the old republic was watching and approving. Every second of the ambush had been rehearsed, but they had rehearsed nothing beyond the last breath. Their assumption was almost childlike in its simplicity. Kill the dictator, and the republic reboots on its own. The Senate walks outside, announces the restoration of the old order, and the citizens of Rome remember how much they loved voting and debate. The conspirators convinced themselves that the people only followed Caesar because they had been seduced. Break the spell, and the world snaps back into place. So they wiped their blades on their own clothing and tried to transform a slaughter into a sacred act. Some of them, like Decimus, kept their voices steady even as their robes clung to their bodies with cooling blood. They called out to the senators still cowering in the chamber, begging them to stay, promising the violence was finished. They needed witnesses. They needed someone to validate what they had done. But the Senate wanted no part of it. When it became obvious that the room was emptying, the Liberators shifted their performance outside. They left Caesar's body where it had fallen, stepped into the open air as a tight, nervous pack, daggers still in hand, and began shouting phrases they had memorized for this exact moment. The tyrant is finished. Liberty lives again. The age of kings is over. Here was the flaw they had never stress-tested. The audience waiting in the forum was not a room full of aristocrats debating constitutional theory. It was a city full of working people, porters, grain haulers, market vendors, craftsmen. These were the Romans who had stood in line for Caesar's food distributions, who had watched his triumphs parade through the streets, who had received citizenship because of laws he had pushed through against senatorial resistance. Standing on the steps, the Liberators searched the crowd for gratitude. They found none. No wave of relief. No shouts of joy. Just thousands of faces staring up at them in silence. Waiting. Caesar's loyalists had not evaporated. Many had heard whispers of trouble and rushed to the center of the city. Now they were looking at a cluster of wealthy men drenched in blood, lecturing them about freedom, while the only leader who had ever given them anything tangible was lying dead on a cold floor behind them. Brutus tried oratory. He believed, down to his marrow, that the right argument could move anyone. His bloodline was built on stories of ancestors who had toppled tyrants. He saw himself as the next chapter of that legacy. So he laid out his reasoning like a lawyer in a courtroom. Caesar had concentrated too much power. He had hollowed out the Senate. He had behaved like a king in everything but title. His death was painful but necessary so that Rome itself could survive. The crowd heard him out. But hearing is not feeling. These were not scholars in a library. These were people who remembered Caesar riding through the streets after Gaul, who had watched him forgive enemies who had tried to destroy him, who had walked through his private gardens on the banks of the Tiber because he had opened them to anyone. The Republic was an abstraction they had never touched. Caesar was a man they had seen, cheered for, and depended on. As the hours crawled forward, a devastating truth settled on the conspirators like dust. They had convinced the Senate that Caesar needed to die. They had not convinced the city. They had no program for what came next. No new food policy. No land reform. No successor the people could rally behind. They had an ideology and a dead man at their feet. Nothing more. Doubt started eating through their confidence like acid. They reached out to other senators for support, but most refused to commit. Some were quietly relieved Caesar was gone, but had no intention of standing beside men the public might tear apart. Others had genuinely admired Caesar and now looked at the conspirators with undisguised hatred. Rome was not behaving like a city that had been liberated. It was behaving like a city holding its breath before an explosion. Into this vacuum, two men moved with terrifying speed. Marcus Antonius, the man we call Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Both had served Caesar with total loyalty. Both had access to armed men. Lepidus commanded troops stationed just outside the city. Antony, as sitting consul, held legal authority and something even more dangerous, an instinct for reading crowds. When word of the assassination reached the military barracks, soldiers who had fought under Caesar's eagle went rigid with fury. Many of them wanted blood. The conspirators had bet everything on the idea that the legions were exhausted from years of civil war, that professional soldiers would not risk another conflict to avenge a single man, no matter how famous. They lost that bet completely. Caesar had made his veterans wealthy and proud. His name was on their standards, their land grants, their identities. Killing him was not a political correction. To them, it was a knife in the back of their commander. Over the next few days, Rome became a negotiation conducted at knife point. Antony offered the appearance of compromise. Amnesty for the assassins in exchange for upholding Caesar's legislation. The Liberators accepted because they were out of options. They believed time would calm the city. They thought they had purchased safety. What they had actually purchased was a brief delay before their own destruction. That destruction began at the funeral. Caesar's body had to be cremated. The only question was how it would happen and who would control the narrative. The conspirators wanted a subdued, orderly ceremony. No inflammatory speeches, no spectacle, a dignified farewell. Then the city moves on. Above all, they feared one thing. They feared Mark Antony standing in front of a crowd with a dead man's story in his mouth. They tried to restrain him, but Antony was consul. He was Caesar's most visible ally, and he understood something about human beings that Brutus never grasped. Brutus believed in logic. Antony believed in feeling. He knew that collective sorrow, pushed in the right direction, at the right speed, becomes collective rage. The day arrived, and the forum filled beyond capacity. Men pressed against each other in every gap between buildings. Women pushed forward with children on their hips, straining to see. Scattered among them were nervous agents of the conspirators, counting heads and realizing they were surrounded. Brutus addressed the crowd first. His speech was measured, intellectual, precise. He explained once more why Caesar had to fall. He invoked the Republic, tradition, the terror of one-man rule. Parts of the crowd stayed quiet. A few heads nodded. But the atmosphere did not shift. No one wept. No one felt their chest crack open. It was a reasoned argument delivered into the mouth of a hurricane. Then Antony climbed the platform. He did not go after Brutus. That would have been reckless. Brutus still carried respect. Instead, Antony played a longer game. He called the conspirators honorable men. He repeated that phrase each time he mentioned them. The first time, it sounded genuine. The second time, less so. By the fifth and sixth repetition, the word honorable had turned into something that tasted like venom. He ignored abstractions entirely and went straight for the senses. He pointed at the wounds on the body. He described which blade had opened which gash. He named the men who had been close enough to strike. He lifted the torn, blood-stained toga and held it up so the entire forum could see the holes punched through it. Then, in a moment of theatrical brilliance that changed the course of history, he unveiled a wax replica of Caesar's corpse, every wound sculpted in detail, and rotated it slowly so even those standing at the far edges could witness what had been done. The forum erupted. Gasps turned to sobs. Sobs turned to screaming. No one was thinking about senatorial privilege or constitutional balance anymore. They were staring at a body that had been butchered by men who now called themselves heroes. Antony spoke of Caesar's mercy, how he had pardoned enemies who had waged war against him, how he had paid for public festivals out of his personal fortune, how he had pushed the crown away when it was offered to him in broad daylight, whatever he may have desired behind closed doors. Caesar was no longer a politician in their minds. He was a father who had been murdered by his own sons. Then Antony delivered the killing blow, the will. Caesar had left 75 drachmas to every single Roman citizen. For the poor, that was not a symbolic gesture. It was real money. On top of that, he had bequeathed his private estates and gardens along the Tiber to the public, open to everyone, forever. It was generosity engineered to detonate at exactly this moment. Antony read the terms aloud. First came disbelief. Then came white-hot anger. The math was devastatingly simple. The man who had just been hacked to pieces had given them money and parkland. The men who had done the hacking had given them lectures about virtue and absolutely nothing else. One side had delivered material comfort. The other side had delivered a body and a speech. The forum became a furnace. Shouting erupted at the edges and swept inward like a wave. People demanded justice. The time for words was over. The crowd had made its verdict, and it was final. Rome was not ready to forget Caesar. Rome wanted to grieve him, and Rome wanted someone to pay. Antony never explicitly called for violence. He did not have to. When the wax figure and the shredded toga were brought closer to the crowd, hands shot out to touch them. Men surged forward with wet eyes and locked jaws. The original plan had been an orderly procession to a designated cremation site. The crowd obliterated that plan in seconds. They took the body. They ripped apart benches, market stalls, wooden signs, anything that could burn. They built a crude pyre right there in the middle of the forum, in the shadow of buildings where the Republic had governed for 500 years. They laid Caesar on top and set the whole thing ablaze. As the fire climbed, so did the violence. People snatched burning branches from the pyre and sprinted through the streets toward the homes of the conspirators, not just the ringleaders. Anyone rumored to have supported them. Houses were broken into, ransacked, set alight. The heart of Rome turned into a war zone without soldiers, and in the chaos, innocent people began to die. There was a poet in the city whose name was Cinna. His only crime was sharing a surname with one of the assassins. When the mob heard that name shouted in the street, they did not pause for clarification. They surrounded him. He begged them to understand. He was not that Cinna. He was a writer. He had nothing to do with the conspiracy. It made no difference. They ripped him to pieces in the open street, murdering the wrong man because he carried the right name. This was the world the Liberators had built without intending to. They had not restored order. They had unleashed a kind of madness where reason held no power. The republic they claimed to worship was supposed to be a civilization of law and argument. Instead, they had turned Rome into a place where sharing a name with the wrong person could get you killed, and where a dead man's will could move a city more than any living man's philosophy. For Brutus and Cassius, the conclusion was inescapable. Rome was a death trap. Antony owned the streets. Caesar's veterans were sharpening their swords. The Senate was fractured and paralyzed. Staying in the capital meant waiting to be torn apart by the same crowd they had promised to liberate. So the coalition that had stood united over Caesar's bleeding body shattered, and the pieces scattered across the map. Cassius fled east toward Syria and the provinces where he had old connections and where Roman governors still commanded battle-ready legions. He began assembling an army, using fear of Antony and lingering resentment of Caesar's overreach to recruit officers and soldiers to his cause. Cassius was a military mind above all else. He understood that in the final calculation, Rome would belong to whoever could put the most disciplined fighters on a battlefield. Brutus headed toward Macedonia and Greece, regions rich with Roman garrisons and prosperous cities whose treasuries could fund a war. He called on former allies, invoked his legendary family name, and promised a campaign to restore everything the Republic had lost. He still believed his reputation alone could fill the ranks. Others, like Decimus, retreated to whatever provinces they could reach, clinging to whatever forces they could scrape together. Back in Rome, Antony tightened his grip. He secured provinces that were supposed to go to other men. He used Caesar's documents, some authentic, some conveniently discovered, to justify every move that expanded his authority. He was not acting as the humble mourner of a fallen leader. He was acting as the man who intended to become the next one. Lepidus, with his legions positioned just outside the city walls, backed him without hesitation. Together, they looked like the undisputed center of gravity in the Roman world. But far to the south, in a small harbor on the Italian coast, something was happening that none of them had anticipated. A ship docked, and a young man stepped off it. He had been across the Adriatic, in Apollonia, on the coast of what is now Albania, recovering from illness and preparing for a military campaign that no longer existed. Caesar's planned invasion of Parthia had died with him, and now this young man had crossed the sea to claim what was left. His name was Gaius Octavius. According to the will that had set Rome on fire, he was now legally Gaius Julius Caesar, adopted son and primary heir of the most powerful man the world had ever known. He was 18, thin, pale, frequently ill. Nobody standing on that dock, watching him walk down the gangplank, would have believed that this unremarkable young man would outlast every general, every senator, and every assassin involved in the conspiracy. That he would command more legions than Antony and Cassius combined. That he would be the one standing over their graves. Almost no one in Rome took him seriously. That miscalculation would cost them everything. Before we go further, let me speak directly to you for a moment. If you are still here, you are not someone who clicks away when a story gets deep. You are the kind of person who wants to understand how power really operates, how ambition consumes people, how empires are born from blood and patience. We created a community for exactly that kind of mind. It is called the lineage. When you join, you are not just supporting a channel. You are keeping these long, uncompromising investigations alive, free from interruption, as thorough and unflinching as they need to be. Members receive early access to new episodes and more. If this is your world, hit the join button and step into the lineage. Because in the next chapter, That sickly, underestimated teenager is going to walk into a city that is devouring itself, look the most powerful men in Rome dead in the eyes, and begin converting a murdered man's name into the most dangerous weapon on earth. Brutus and Cassius believe they have escaped. They believe distance and time are on their side. They believe they can raise armies large enough to dictate terms. What they have not yet realized is that the real predator has just set foot in Italy, and he will not rest until every single one of them is in the ground. When Octavian set foot on Italian soil, he was not arriving home. He was stepping into a war that had no front lines, no uniforms, and no rules. Word of Caesar's assassination had reached him across the Adriatic in Apollonia, and with it came the impossible news buried in the will. Julius Caesar had not named a battle-tested commander as his successor. He had not chosen a powerful senator with decades of influence. He had chosen this pale, frequently ill young man, his grandnephew, and adopted him as his son from beyond the grave. On parchment, Octavian had just inherited the most famous name in the world, a claim to a vast fortune, and the political weight of a dead god. In practice, he had inherited a death sentence. Every person close to him begged him to stay away. Wait, let the wolves in Rome devour each other first. See who survives between Antony, the Senate, and the conspirators, and then decide. They reminded him that Antony had already seized Caesar's documents, Caesar's money, and the loyalty of Caesar's veterans across Italy. To Antony, a teenage heir was either a puppet to be used or a rival to be crushed. To Brutus and Cassius, he was a living symbol of everything they had tried to destroy. The rational move was to disappear. Octavian refused. His body was weak. He was not an imposing figure on horseback or in a room full of soldiers. But behind that frail exterior lived something far more dangerous than physical strength. A mind that calculated without sentiment. He understood one thing with absolute clarity. If he behaved like a frightened boy hiding across the sea, that is all he would ever be. But if he walked into Rome wearing Caesar's name, carrying Caesar's will, speaking as Caesar's son, he could test whether that name still held the power to move men. If it did, he could build an empire on it. If it did not, then nothing he did from Apollonia would matter anyway. He made his choice. He accepted the adoption formally. From that day forward, he demanded to be addressed as Gaius Julius Caesar. Historians use the name Octavian to keep things clear, but the people he encountered heard only one thing: the dead dictator's name, spoken by a living voice. He did not want to be the grandnephew. He wanted to be the resurrection. It was the most calculated act of personal reinvention the ancient world had ever seen. When he arrived in Rome, he found Antony already entrenched. Antony had orchestrated the funeral. Antony held the consulship. Antony had grabbed control of provinces Caesar had allocated to other men. Antony had positioned himself beside the treasury, or whatever remained of it after decades of war and lavish public spending. The assassins had scattered. The Senate was cowering. In that vacuum, Antony saw himself as the obvious successor to Caesar's authority. So when this gaunt teenager appeared in the city, calling himself Caesar, Antony treated him like a joke. He mocked him openly. He kept the money locked away. He tried to reduce Octavian to a decorative symbol, useful for rallies, but excluded from real decisions. He fully expected the boy to accept whatever scraps were offered and be thankful for them. Octavian let him believe that. He showed deference in public. He played the part of the grateful, humble youth. And behind that mask, he went to work on the only audiences that mattered: the people and the soldiers. one conversation at a time. What he did next stunned the entire city. Rather than fighting Antony for control of Caesar's treasury, he emptied his own pockets. He sold personal property. He borrowed against everything he had. He scraped together funds from every source he could reach. And he used that money to pay out the bequests Caesar had promised in his will. 75 drachmas for every Roman citizen. He stood before crowds and said it plainly. Caesar made you a promise. I am Caesar now, and I am keeping it. The financial cost nearly destroyed him. The political return was beyond calculation. Here was a teenager draining his own fortune to honor a dead man's word. Meanwhile, Antony sat on the state treasury and moved slowly. Romans did not need anyone to explain the contrast. They saw it with their own eyes. Soldiers who had bled under Caesar's command watched this young man bankrupt himself to fulfill their commander's final wishes, and they began asking themselves a question that would reshape the world. Who is the true heir to Caesar? The man holding the keys to the vault, or the boy willing to empty his own? At the same time, the Senate was souring on Antony. Cicero, the legendary orator and former consul, despised Antony as a crude strongman, dragging Rome toward one-man rule. He launched a series of devastating public attacks, the speeches known as the Philippics, in which he dismantled Antony's character, his ambitions, and his fitness to lead. Cicero looked at Octavian and saw something useful, not a future leader, a temporary weapon. He believed he could point this eager young heir at Antony, let them destroy each other, and then sweep the wreckage aside to rebuild the Republic on his own terms. Octavian saw through Cicero completely, and he let the old man keep thinking he was in control. Under Cicero's encouragement, the Senate pushed Octavian to raise troops against Antony, framing it as a defense of Republican liberty. Octavian went along, but when he stood before veterans, he did not speak about senatorial rights or constitutional tradition. He spoke about Caesar. He showed them the will. He reminded them who had given them land, who had made them proud, who had treated them as men and not as tools. He told them Antony was squandering that legacy. They responded. Men who had marched across Gaul and fought through civil wars enlisted under a teenager because he carried the name that meant everything to them, and because he was paying them now, not promising payment someday. Small groups grew into cohorts. Cohorts became legions. In an astonishingly short span of time, a young man who had never stood on a battlefield had an army at his back. It was not the largest force in Italy, but it was bound to him by something stronger than orders. It was bound by memory and by gold. The standoff between Antony and the Senate finally cracked into open warfare. Antony moved to seize Cisalpine Gaul by force. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Two sitting consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, marched north alongside Octavian to stop him. In the fighting near Mutina, Antony was driven back, but not broken. Both consuls were killed in the battles. Their deaths opened a gap that no one else could fill. Command of the surviving legions fell to the only leader left standing, with both legal authority and armed men behind him. Octavian, the teenager. The Senate thanked him for his service. Then they made a mistake that would cost them everything. They tried to push him aside. They awarded honors to other commanders. They treated him, once again, like a useful boy who should step back and let the adults take over. Octavian's response was the kind of move that separates historical footnotes from historical forces. He turned his legions toward Rome itself. He marched on the capital, camped his soldiers outside the walls, and sent a single message to the Senate: "Make me consul." He was 19 years old. There was nothing to negotiate. The Senate capitulated. Octavian became the youngest consul in Roman history through the blunt logic of armed force. Once in office, he passed laws that formalized his adoption and cemented his legal identity as Caesar's son. But the deeper message needed no legislation. He had power. He was willing to deploy it. And anyone who still saw him as a controllable instrument was making the last mistake of their political life. While this was happening, Antony had retreated west and merged his forces with those of Lepidus in Gaul and Spain. Their combined legions now rivaled Octavian's. 3 men, all loyal to Caesar's memory, each commanding armies, each hungry for dominance, faced a choice that would determine the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. They could tear each other apart, which would give Brutus and Cassius in the east all the time they needed to consolidate their own massive army. Or they could swallow their hatred for each other, unite, and destroy the assassins first. They chose unity. For now. In the final weeks of 43 BCE, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus converged near Bononia, the city we now call Bologna, on a narrow island sitting in the middle of a river. The setting was unremarkable. The stakes were the highest in Roman history. Each man arrived with a small personal guard. Each man stepped onto that island knowing that if the conversation failed, the Roman world would fracture into a war with no end. None of them trusted the others. Antony looked at Octavian and saw an arrogant child who had hijacked Caesar's legacy with a name and a checkbook. Octavian looked at Antony and saw a dangerous brute who would crush him the moment it became convenient. Lepidus wanted to survive and hold on to whatever power he could without being devoured by either of them. But beneath the suspicion, one thing connected all 3. A burning hatred for the men who had murdered Caesar, and a hunger for power that none of them could satisfy alone. Over several days of negotiation, they forged an agreement that would remake the Roman world from its foundations. They created a formal office backed by the full weight of law, the Second Triumvirate. This was not a handshake deal like the old arrangement between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. This was codified authority. The 3 triumvirs were granted near total power for 5 years. They could pass laws without the Senate's approval. They could appoint officials at will. They were, in every meaningful sense, 3 dictators sharing a single throne. But thrones need funding. And war needs more funding than anything. To crush Brutus and Cassius, they needed to pay, feed, equip, and transport tens of thousands of soldiers across the sea. The Roman treasury was already gutted. Caesar had spent heavily. The civil wars had drained what was left. There was only one method fast enough to fill the coffers and eliminate domestic enemies in a single stroke. They turned to the proscriptions. The word sounds bureaucratic. What it meant was slaughter by paperwork. A proscription list was a public death warrant. Names of Roman citizens, senators, equestrians, wealthy landowners were posted on boards in the forum for anyone to read. Any person who killed a man on the list was entitled to a bounty. A portion of the dead man's property went to the state. Another portion went to whoever brought proof of the killing. Sons could not inherit their father's estate. Wives could not shield family assets. Everything flowed upward to the 3 men sitting on that island. The way they assembled the lists was surgical and grotesque. Ancient writers described the 3 of them sitting together, writing names on tablets, bargaining over lives the way merchants argue over livestock. When one man objected to a name, another offered a trade. "Spare your ally, but give me mine." One account records that Antony surrendered his own uncle to the list in exchange for the death of someone Octavian wanted gone. Life for life, name for name. each concession purchased with someone else's blood. When the lists hit the streets, Rome became a hunting ground. Citizens walked into the Forum one morning and found boards covered in names. Hundreds of them. Senators, knights, men of wealth and influence, men who had spoken against Caesar's faction, men who had mocked Antony in public, men who had once dismissed Octavian as irrelevant. Some names were there for political reasons. Others were there because their estates were valuable and could be liquidated to fund the coming war. And in the margins, personal vendettas slipped in like poison. Armed squads fanned out across the city. Doors were kicked open before dawn. Some victims were dragged from their beds. Others were butchered in the streets in broad daylight. Killers carried severed heads to the Forum as receipts, demanding their bounties. Wives turned in husbands to protect themselves and their children. Slaves denounced masters for reward money or out of accumulated hatred. Sons raced to betray fathers before a neighbor could do it first and claim the prize. Italy convulsed. People hid in underground storerooms, in tombs, in the crawl spaces beneath villas. Country estates were raided by bounty hunters working in packs. The wealthy tried to bribe their way onto ships heading anywhere out of Italy. Some shaved their heads or changed their appearance to pass through checkpoints. Others sought refuge in temples, hoping sacred ground would protect them. More often than not, it did not. One name on the lists eclipsed all others: Marcus Tullius Cicero. Cicero had never commanded an army. He had never swung a sword in battle. His weapons were language and law. Decades earlier, as consul, he had exposed and crushed a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic, led by a man named Catiline. He had ordered the conspirators executed without trial, a decision that haunted him with exile and controversy for years. He considered himself the Republic's conscience, its voice, its last line of intellectual defense. But in his Philippics against Antony, he had made himself a target that could not be ignored. He had humiliated a man who now held the legal power to erase anyone he chose. For a time, it seemed Octavian might shield him. The young heir and the aging orator had worked side by side against Antony. Cicero had publicly called Octavian the Republic's brightest hope. But on that river island near Bononia, when Antony placed Cicero's name on the table, Octavian had to decide: protect the man who had tried to use him as a disposable weapon, or sacrifice that man's life to secure the alliance he needed to survive. He chose survival. Cicero's name went onto the list. When Cicero learned he was marked for death, he tried to run. He had a coastal villa near Formiae. A ship could take him to safety. For days, he wavered between the shore and his estate, pulled between the instinct to flee and the exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire life fighting with words and watching words fail. He was old, he was tired, and the Republic he had given everything to defend was already a corpse. The killers found him on the road, carried in a litter by his servants. When the armed men appeared, his attendants panicked. Cicero, according to the accounts that survived, told them to set the litter down. He leaned out, exposed his neck, and spoke his last recorded words. "Do what you came to do, soldier, but at least do it cleanly." They took his head. They took his hands, the same hands that had written the most powerful political prose in Roman history. The same hands that had gestured from the rostra while defending the Republic before crowds of thousands. Those severed pieces were carried back to Rome as trophies. Antony's wife, Fulvia, reportedly took Cicero's head in her lap, spat on his face, and drove a golden hairpin through his tongue. Whether every detail of that story is literal truth or embellishment shaped by time, the meaning was unmistakable. The voice that had challenged power was silenced. The hands that had written against tyranny were nailed to the very platform where they had once held a nation's attention. Cicero's head and hands were displayed on the rostra for the city to see. The speaker's platform, where he had delivered his greatest orations, now held his remains as a public warning. Challenge the men in power, and this is what becomes of you. Something fundamental shattered with Cicero's death. Rome did not just lose a man. It lost the last person who could stand in the Senate and make an argument that anyone felt obligated to answer. After him, the Senate became a rubber stamp. Debate became theater. Power no longer flowed from persuasion. It flowed from lists on a wall and soldiers at the door. The killing continued for months. Ancient sources estimate that 300 senators and 2,000 members of the equestrian class were proscribed and killed. The number of ordinary citizens who died in the chaos, caught in crossfire, murdered over personal grudges disguised as political ones, betrayed by neighbors, is unknown and will never be known. Estates were confiscated. Villas were redistributed. The triumvirs achieved exactly what they needed: a war chest large enough to fund an invasion, and a level of terror deep enough to ensure no one in Italy would dare oppose them while they were gone. Step back for a moment and look at the full picture. Just a few years before this, Rome had still operated under the pretense of a constitutional republic. Senators debated, citizens voted, laws were argued in public. Now, 3 men could point at a name carved into a wooden board and end a human life, then sell that person's home to pay for warships. The machinery of self-governance had been gutted and repurposed as a weapon aimed at Rome's own people. If you are still watching at this point, you understand what kind of story this is. This is not a textbook summary of ancient politics. This is a record of how quickly a civilization can devour itself when ambition and vengeance replace law and restraint. If this kind of deep, uncomfortable history is what pulls you in, there is something worth mentioning. We have linked in the pinned comment a physical volume that is, in my judgment, the most concentrated collection of dark history ever bound between 2 covers. It is not casual reading. It is a dense, substantial book that catalogs the most brutal rulers, the bloodiest conflicts, and the most disturbing exercises of power in human history. If you know someone obsessed with empires and the price they extract, this is the gift. If you are that person, this is the book that will sit on your nightstand and refuse to let you sleep. When this video ends, check the pinned comment and follow the link. If this story has its hooks in you, that book will not let go. By the time the proscriptions finally ebbed, the triumvirs had accomplished their first objective. Their treasury was full. Their domestic enemies were dead, exiled, or terrified into silence. Now they could turn their full attention to the second objective. The men who had started all of this, the assassins. Brutus and Cassius were not sitting idle on the other side of the sea. They had spent their months of exile building a war machine of staggering proportions. They had seized control of the wealthiest eastern provinces. They had extracted taxes, commandeered supplies, and recruited soldiers from every corner of the Roman East. They minted their own coins, stamped with the image of 2 daggers flanking a cap of liberty, and the inscription Ides of March, the Ides of March. They wanted every soldier who held one of those coins to remember that the assassination was not a crime. It was a cause. Between them, they commanded more than 40 legions, supported by naval squadrons and enormous financial reserves. On parchment, their strength matched or even exceeded what the triumvirs could field. They had numbers. They had money. They had geography on their side. But they did not have unity of purpose. Cassius was the sharper military mind, cautious, experienced, a man who understood supply lines and defensive positioning. Brutus was the intellectual, the philosopher soldier, admired by some of his officers, but less instinctive in command, more prone to grand gestures than to grinding tactical discipline. Their partnership was held together not by shared vision, but by shared fear. They both knew that defeat meant annihilation. There would be no amnesty this time, no negotiated exile. If they lost, every one of them would die. The Triumvirs mobilized their own legions. Antony brought hardened veterans who had fought through years of civil war and knew nothing but victory under Caesar's banner. Octavian, still battling illness, still physically unimposing, led troops that followed him for two reasons: the name stitched onto their standards and the coin already in their hands. Lepidus held a secondary role, guarding Italy and the western provinces, while the two dominant partners prepared to cross the sea. When their fleets finally launched across the Adriatic, the men on those ships were not sailing toward a foreign enemy. They were sailing to kill other Romans, men who had trained in the same camps, marched under the same eagles, shared the same rations, and sung the same songs around the same fires. The scale of what was approaching defied comprehension. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers would soon stand across from each other on a wide plain in Macedonia, near an unremarkable town called Philippi. On those fields, the long reverberations of 23 dagger blows in a marble chamber would finally reach their crescendo. Cassius would squint through clouds of dust and make a fatal misreading. Brutus would encounter something in the darkness of his tent that he would later describe as a monstrous phantom. Octavian, the frail heir everyone had underestimated, would spend part of the battle hiding in a marsh during a collapse of his own lines and still walk out the other side alive. Antony would do what he had always done best: drive straight into the heart of an enemy formation and rip it apart with brute force. Everything that had happened since the Ides of March, the proscriptions, the speeches, the betrayals, the severed heads nailed to the rostra, had been building toward this single collision. Two visions of Rome were about to crash into each other on a Macedonian plain: the men who murdered Caesar in the name of liberty, and the men who butchered half of Rome in the name of vengeance. In the next chapter, we go to Philippi, where spirits visit generals in the dead of night, where entire armies disappear into fog, and where the Republic finally falls on its own blade. The fields outside Philippi looked like the edge of civilization itself. Two Roman armies, camped across from each other on a stretch of marshland and low ridges, staring into what amounted to a mirror. Standards snapped in the wind. Smoke from thousands of cook fires thickened the air until it tasted like ash. On one side, the forces of Brutus and Cassius, bankrolled by the plundered wealth of the eastern provinces, more than 40 legions deep. On the other, the combined might of Antony and Octavian, soldiers forged in civil war, sharpened by the proscriptions, and promised fortunes if they survived what was coming. This was not Rome defending itself against an outside threat. This was Rome preparing to open its own veins. Half the men standing in those formations had once served under the same commander. They had shared camps, shared victories, shared meals. Now they were arranged in battle lines designed to drive iron through each other's bodies. Inside his command tent, Cassius pored over the terrain. He was the more experienced general by far. He understood that time was his ally, not his enemy. His army controlled the high ground and the surrounding supply routes. If he could force the Triumvirs to sit in those low, wet fields for weeks or months, disease and starvation would do the killing for him. He pressed for patience. Hold position. Let the enemy rot. Brutus saw it differently. he did not trust patience. He worried that his soldiers, many of whom had fought under Caesar before switching sides, might lose their nerve if the standoff dragged on. He feared desertion. He feared the appearance of cowardice. More than anything, he believed that a decisive, open battle was the only morally acceptable conclusion to everything they had set in motion. They had killed a dictator in the name of courage and principle. Hiding behind walls would make that act look hollow. The tension between them ran deeper than tactics. Cassius had joined the conspiracy out of cold pragmatism. Brutus had joined because he believed in an idea. That philosophical divide now infected every strategic decision. Cassius wanted to win the war. Brutus wanted to win the argument. In the nights before the clash, the camps hummed with a kind of dread that no amount of discipline could fully suppress. Soldiers ground their blades against stones. They repaired straps and checked shield grips. They lay on hard ground and tried to sleep while knowing that the men across the field would be trying to kill them by morning. Officers circulated through the lines, delivering orders, counting heads, pretending confidence they did not feel. And somewhere in that darkness, something happened to Brutus that would haunt every retelling of this story for 2,000 years. The ancient sources record that Brutus was sitting alone in his tent late at night, reading by lamplight, when a shape materialized in front of him. Enormous, dark, not quite human. Brutus, to his credit, did not run. He looked at it and asked what it was. The figure answered in a voice that carried no warmth, "I am your doom. We will meet again at Philippi." Did it happen? Did exhaustion and guilt manufacture a phantom in a tired man's mind? It does not matter. What matters is that Brutus believed it enough to tell the people closest to him. And then he walked out of that tent and led men into a battle where his entire philosophy of life would be put to the test. The first clash at Philippi came in October of 42 BCE. The terrain gave no clean advantage to either side. Ridges, bogs, and a strategically critical hill divided the field into sectors where coordination was almost impossible. Antony, true to his nature, refused to wait. He began driving construction crews through the marshes, building causeways designed to loop around Cassius's flank and sever his connection to the sea and his supply lines. Cassius could see the threat developing in real time. If those earthworks were completed, his army would be strangled. He was forced to act. His troops collided with Antony's in savage, close quarters, fighting along the marsh edges. Simultaneously, on the opposite end of the battlefield, Brutus ordered his own legions forward against Octavian's camp. What followed was a battle fought in near blindness. Dust swallowed visibility. The noise was deafening. Entire cohorts surged forward, shattered against resistance, reformed, and surged again. Trumpet signals competed with screaming. In Brutus's sector, his men broke through. They overran Octavian's camp completely. Octavian himself was gone. Some accounts say illness had forced him to be moved before the fighting began. Others say he crawled into a swamp and hid, while his headquarters was destroyed around him. His officers were cut down. His standards were captured. From where Brutus stood, it looked like total victory. On Cassius's side of the field, the opposite was happening. Antony's veterans smashed through his defenses, overran his camp, and set his tents ablaze. Cassius watched columns of smoke rise from his own position. He saw cavalry streaming away in retreat. Communication between the two halves of the Liberator army had collapsed entirely. Runners arrived late, carrying contradictory information. From Cassius's vantage point, squinting through a haze of dust and smoke from a nearby hill, the battle appeared to be a catastrophe. He sent one of his most trusted officers, a man named Titinius, to ride toward where Brutus's forces should be. and report back on what was happening. Then Cassius watched from the hilltop as a group of horsemen surrounded Titinius in the distance. The men standing beside Cassius shouted that Titinius had been captured by the enemy. Cassius had seen enough, or he thought he had. The man who had helped orchestrate the most famous assassination in history could not stomach the idea of being dragged in chains before the men he had tried to destroy. He refused to become a spectacle. He turned to his servant Pindarus and asked for help ending it. Ancient tradition holds that the blade Cassius used was the same one he had driven into Julius Caesar on the Senate floor. On a windswept hill in Macedonia, far from the city he claimed to have saved, Cassius leaned into that sword and died believing that everything was lost. He was wrong about almost all of it. Minutes later, Titinius returned, not as a prisoner. He was wearing a victory wreath. He had ridden into Brutus's lines, not the enemy's. The horsemen who had surrounded him were celebrating, not capturing. When Titinius reached the hilltop and found Cassius dead on the ground, the weight of the mistake crushed him. Some accounts say he took his own life on the spot. Brutus arrived shortly after, looked down at the body of his partner, and reportedly called him the last true Roman. It was a eulogy delivered over a corpse created by a misunderstanding. The most strategically capable mind in the Liberator movement had destroyed itself because dust clouds and distance made friends look like enemies. The first battle of Philippi ended without a clear winner on the field. Brutus had crushed Octavian's wing and ransacked his camp. Antony had crushed Cassius's wing and ransacked his. Tactically, it was a draw. Strategically, it was a disaster for the assassins. Cassius, the one man among them who understood how to fight a grinding, disciplined campaign, was gone, and he had taken himself out of the war. In the weeks that followed, Brutus tried to hold the fractured army together through sheer force of personality. He absorbed Cassius's surviving troops into his own command. He delivered speeches about honor, about the righteousness of their cause, about the debt they owed to the Republic. Outwardly, he projected calm and certainty, but his soldiers could feel the shift. They had watched one of their two commanders kill himself over a mistake. Confidence was bleeding out of the army like water from a cracked vessel. Across the field, Antony and Octavian rebuilt. Octavian was shaken by the humiliation of the first engagement, but he was alive. Antony's battlefield reputation had only grown stronger. He had proven once again that when it came to raw, violent combat, few men in the Roman world could match him. They could replace lost equipment. They could reinforce battered units. The Liberators could not replace Cassius. The second collision came roughly 3 weeks later. By then, the advantages that had favored Brutus at the start had eroded badly. His supply situation was deteriorating. Morale was crumbling. His officers were split between those who wanted to negotiate and those who still believed in fighting. Brutus, driven by pride and perhaps by the growing conviction that retreat would erase everything the assassination had meant, chose to attack. When the battle lines crashed together for the second time, the outcome revealed itself quickly. Antony's legions hit with the kind of fury that experienced soldiers channel when they smell the end of a campaign. Octavian's troops, burning to redeem themselves, pushed forward with a ferocity they had not shown in the first fight. Brutus's army began to disintegrate. Units broke formation and ran. Officers screamed orders that no one followed. Within hours, the structure that had held together an army of tens of thousands simply ceased to exist. Brutus escaped the collapse with a handful of loyal followers. They reached a hill away from the main slaughter and stopped. From there, he could see the dust settling over a field covered with the dead and the surrendering. There was no partial victory to claim this time. no captured camp to balance the scales. His army was finished. The men who had once raised their cups to liberty in Roman dining halls were now lying face down in Macedonian dirt, or dropping their weapons and begging to be spared. He asked his companions to help him die. Most of them refused. They could not bring themselves to raise a blade against the man they had followed across the sea. Finally, one of them, a soldier named Strato, agreed to hold a sword steady while Brutus threw himself onto it. Before he did, Brutus is said to have spoken words about virtue, declaring that he had worshipped it his entire life only to discover it was nothing but an empty word. Whether he used those precise phrases or not, they capture the essence of his final moment. The man who murdered Caesar to save an ideal died realizing that the ideal had not saved anything. When Antony reached the body, he did not desecrate it. He had known Brutus before all of this. He recognized bravery, even in a man whose judgment he considered catastrophic. He ordered that Brutus receive an honorable burial, and that his ashes be sent to his mother in Rome. Even this small gesture carried political calculation. Antony wanted the world to see him as a man who could be magnanimous in victory. With both Brutus and Cassius dead, the organized military resistance of the Liberators disintegrated. Their surviving legions were folded into the Triumvir's forces or dissolved. The men who had stood in a circle around Caesar's body and driven their blades into him had now lost their final wager on an open battlefield. But the story did not end on the plains of Philippi. It transformed into something colder, a manhunt that stretched across years and continents. Some of the conspirators had already met gruesome ends before Philippi was even fought. Gaius Trebonius, the man who had kept Mark Antony distracted outside the Senate chamber while the others surrounded Caesar, had been governing the province of Asia when he was seized by forces loyal to Publius Cornelius Dolabella. Trebonius was subjected to prolonged torture before being decapitated. Ancient writers record that soldiers used his severed head as a plaything, kicking it through the streets like a ball. A man who had once held the rank of consul, reduced to a toy for bored legionaries. Decimus Brutus, the conspirator who had personally convinced Caesar to ignore the warnings and attend the Senate that morning, had tried to maintain his power base in northern Italy after the assassination. When the political ground shifted beneath him, he attempted to flee northward, hoping to reach the Liberator forces gathering in the east. He never came close. A Gallic tribal leader captured him. On Antony's orders, Decimus was executed, his dream of republican liberty ending in an unmarked death far from the city where he had helped spill Caesar's blood. Casca, the man ancient sources identify as having struck the first blow, the one who broke the boundary between conspiracy and action, reportedly took his own life after Philippi, rather than allow himself to be captured. The noose around the assassins was tightening. No formal tribunal condemned them. No judge passed sentence. They were simply pursued until they were gone. One man evaded the hunt far longer than anyone else. Cassius Parmensis had been part of the inner circle around Brutus and Cassius, but he possessed a survival instinct that the others lacked. After Philippi, he attached himself to Sextus Pompey, the son of Pompey the Great, who had built a rogue naval empire based in Sicily and used his fleet to choke Rome's grain supply. When Sextus was eventually crushed, Cassius Parmensis pivoted again, joining Antony in the eastern Mediterranean. He watched the years unspool. He saw alliances forged and betrayed. He watched Antony sink deeper into his partnership with Cleopatra, the last queen of Ptolemaic Egypt. He must have understood, with growing dread, that Octavian had not forgotten a single name from that day in the Senate. 14 years after the assassination, agents of Octavian tracked Cassius Parmensis to Athens and killed him there. He was the last known surviving assassin of Julius Caesar. The sickly teenager the conspirators had dismissed as irrelevant had outlived every one of them and ensured that each of them died. After Philippi, the Roman world was carved into spheres of influence. Antony claimed the wealthy East, Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and the treasuries they contained. Lepidus received the provinces of North Africa. Octavian took Italy and the West. The arrangement looked like a partnership. It functioned as a countdown. Octavian's immediate challenges after the battle were not foreign wars, but domestic crises of his own making. He had promised farmland to tens of thousands of veterans. Delivering on that promise meant evicting Italian families from land they had worked for generations. Entire villages were emptied at sword point so that former soldiers could be settled. The dispossessions triggered revolts and armed resistance, including the conflict known as the Perusian War, in which Lucius Antonius and Fulvia, Mark Antony's own brother and wife, raised forces against Octavian inside Italy. He crushed them, burned the city of Perugia to the ground, and made the cost of opposing him viscerally clear. Even the relatives of his own allies were not safe if they threatened his control. While Octavian fought these brutal internal battles, Antony was living a radically different existence in the East. In Tarsus, he encountered Cleopatra VII, a woman who had already shared a political and intimate bond with Julius Caesar himself. She and Antony formed an alliance that was simultaneously strategic, romantic, and dynastic. Cleopatra had access to Egypt's staggering wealth. Antony had the legions. Together they commanded resources that dwarfed anything Octavian could muster on his own. Cleopatra bore Antony children. Antony reciprocated by granting her Roman-controlled territories and royal titles in a series of ceremonies historians call the Donations of Alexandria. To Romans back in Italy, this looked like something between scandal and treason. A Roman general carving up the empire and handing pieces of it to an Eastern queen, raising children who might one day claim sovereignty over Roman provinces. Octavian recognized the threat, and more importantly, recognized the weapon it handed him. He launched a propaganda campaign of extraordinary sophistication. He never publicly framed the coming conflict as one Roman leader attacking another. He framed it as Rome defending itself against a foreign queen who had bewitched one of its generals. He portrayed Antony as a man who had surrendered his Roman identity, who preferred Egyptian luxury to Roman duty, who would drag the Republic under the heel of a foreign monarch. He produced what he claimed was Antony's will, a document stating that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra rather than in Rome. The narrative took hold. Romans who had endured a generation of civil war were desperate for stability. They could tolerate a single strong leader. What they could not tolerate was the image of that leader shackled to a foreign throne, ruling from a palace in Egypt instead of from the Forum. By converting Antony into Cleopatra's captive in the public imagination, Octavian gave Rome a foreign enemy to rally against instead of another Roman civil war to dread. By 32 BCE, the pretense of partnership had crumbled entirely. Antony and Cleopatra assembled a massive combined fleet and army in Greece. Octavian's forces, commanded at sea by his brilliant admiral Marcus Agrippa, moved to intercept. The collision came at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, in 31 BCE. Actium was not the kind of battle poets dream about. It was won by logistics, positioning, and nerve. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet consisted of enormous, heavily armored warships, impressive in size but sluggish in the confined waters near the coast. Agrippa deployed lighter, faster vessels that could dart in, strike, and withdraw before the heavier ships could respond. He used his mobility to block escape routes and harass the enemy into confusion. At a pivotal moment in the engagement, Cleopatra's squadron broke formation and sailed directly through a gap in the battle line, heading for open water at full speed. Antony, seeing her flee, made the decision that ended his career. He abandoned his own fleet and followed her. Their departure broke the spirit of every ship and soldier they left behind. Captains who had been prepared to fight to the death saw their commanders vanishing over the horizon and lost the will to continue. Ships surrendered. Others were rammed and burned. On shore, Antony's land army waited in stunned disbelief for orders that would never come. Their war was over before most of them had drawn a sword. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, but their position deteriorated with every passing week. Officers deserted. Allies switched sides. Octavian's propaganda machine painted them as already defeated, already doomed. In 30 BCE, Octavian invaded Egypt itself. Antony attempted one last stand and failed. Facing the certainty of capture and public humiliation, he drove his own sword into his body. Cleopatra survived him briefly. When it became clear that Octavian intended to drag her through the streets of Rome as a living trophy in his triumph, she chose to end her life on her own terms. The ancient sources say she used the venom of a snake, though the precise method remains debated after 2 millennia. What is not debated is the result. Antony and Cleopatra died in Alexandria within days of each other. With their deaths, the last credible challenger to Octavian's supremacy was erased from the earth. Octavian entered Alexandria not as the gaunt teenager who had stumbled off a ship years earlier, but as the unchallenged master of the known world. He ordered the execution of Caesarion, the son Cleopatra had borne to Julius Caesar, eliminating the only other person alive who could claim to be the son of Caesar. He annexed Egypt not as a Roman province, but as his personal estate, a treasury so vast it made him wealthier than the Roman state itself. Then he sailed back to Italy, carrying more wealth, more power, and more legitimacy than any Roman in history. Now came the final transformation in a story that began with 23 stab wounds on a marble floor. Rome was exhausted beyond description. An entire generation had known nothing but civil war, proscriptions, land seizures, and uncertainty. The old aristocratic families that had once filled the Senate with confident, independent voices had been gutted by decades of purges and battlefield losses. The Senate still convened, but it was a hollowed institution, a building full of men who owed their survival to the person sitting across from them. Octavian understood the psychology of this moment with a precision that bordered on genius. He did not storm into the Senate and declare himself king. Romans had spent 5 centuries defining themselves by their hatred of monarchy. The word rex was political poison, so instead of seizing the title, he performed a surrender. In 27 BCE, Octavian stood before the Senate and announced that the emergency was over. He was returning his extraordinary powers to the state. He presented himself as a citizen who had done what necessity demanded and now wished only to retire into private life. It was the most masterful piece of political theater the ancient world ever witnessed. The Senate, packed with men who knew exactly what was expected of them, responded on cue. They pleaded with him to stay. They insisted that the state would collapse without his guidance. They showered him with new titles and expanded authorities. The most significant title they bestowed was Augustus, a word that carried connotations of sacred grandeur without technically meaning king. He accepted it with carefully rehearsed reluctance. From that day forward, he was Imperator Caesar Augustus. He controlled every province where significant military forces were stationed. He held the loyalty of the army through decades of shared hardship and generous pay. He had the gratitude of citizens who credited him with ending the wars. And he had the silent compliance of everyone who remembered the proscription lists. He called himself Princeps, first among citizens. In every way that mattered, he was the first emperor of Rome. Simultaneously, Julius Caesar received formal divine status. A comet that had blazed across the sky shortly after his assassination was declared proof that his soul had ascended to the heavens. A temple was erected to Divus Julius, the divine Julius, and Octavian, now Augustus, claimed for himself the title Divi Filius, son of a god. The conspirators who had killed Caesar to prevent one man from rising above the Republic had instead created a world in which Caesar was worshipped as a deity, and his heir ruled as a living demigod. The Republic did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It bled out over years, one wound at a time. It bled on the Senate floor when the daggers came out. It bled in the silence of the crowd that refused to celebrate the assassins. It bled in the fire of Caesar's funeral pyre and in the screams of the mob that followed. It bled through the names scratched onto proscription lists. It bled across the plains of Philippi where Romans butchered Romans. And it bled its last when Octavian stood before the Senate and offered to give back power that everyone in the room knew he would never release. Brutus and Cassius told themselves they were rescuing Rome from tyranny. What they actually accomplished was the destruction of the only political class capable of sustaining the Republic. Their assassination triggered a cascade of civil wars that annihilated the senators, the orators, the generals, and the institutions that might have checked a future strongman. By the time the killing stopped, there was simply no one left with the power or the will to resist. The people, broken by decades of chaos, did not mourn the Republic. They welcomed the emperor. Stability was worth more to them than any principle written on parchment. The 23 wounds the conspirators carved into Caesar's body did not prevent one-man rule. They guaranteed it. They cleared the path for a successor who was more patient, more calculating, and more ruthless than Caesar had ever been. Augustus ruled for over 40 years. He rebuilt the state in his own image so thoroughly that no one who came after him could reassemble what had existed before. In trying to kill the idea of a king, the assassins built the throne. If you made it to the end of this story, you are not here for surface-level history. You followed the blood from the Senate floor through riots, purges, battlefields, and palace suicides, all the way to a young man sitting on a throne constructed from the mistakes of every person who underestimated him. If you want more investigations like this one, stories that refuse to look away when the details get dark, subscribe and hit the like button. That single action tells the algorithm that long-form, uncompromising history belongs in people's feeds. Send this video to someone who still thinks the Ides of March was the ending and not the first page of a much longer, much bloodier chapter. Leave a comment telling us which moment in this story hit you the hardest, or which figure from the ancient world you want us to investigate next. This is Ancestral, the world's best dark history channel, and we are only getting started.